Hey Doug.
Hello, Sean.
Okay, so today we're gonna talk about counter offers.
Mm-hmm.
You wanted to talk about counter offers. So, and for a buyer and a seller, why don't you just maybe tell us what counter offers are
Sure.
and why it's important to know about that
Sure.
as a buyer or a seller?
Okay. Well, let's just start off. Let's start on the seller side first. You're waiting for an offer to come in, and yay, a buyer calls up and says they've made an offer on your home, and so then we go over the offer. And find out that the offer maybe isn't quite what we wanted as far as price goes.
Okay.
They might want some more personal property thrown in that maybe we didn't think about from the very beginning that we'd want to part with.
Sure.
So
That's
there's a
pretty normal.
number, closing date.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they might be asking for some closing costs to be paid for their, to
For the
offset
mortgage.
for the mortgage.
Okay. Okay.
So then we decide, well, is the offer good enough as it stands right now so that we don't have to make a counter offer to the buyer? And if it is, well, then that's pretty simple. We just sign it, and we've got an accepted purchase agreement.
Okay.
But whatever we want to counter offer, if that's where we want to go, then we fill out a separate form
Mm-hmm.
that says counter offer. Mr. Buyer, you offered to me, thank you very much, but I didn't like this, I didn't like that. So you suggest how you would want to sell the property, if it's the price or deleting personal property, closing date, whatever. Then that goes back to the buyer. So what happens as soon as you make a counter offer,
Mm-hmm.
you have to realize that now it's all like the buyer has never even made an offer, because their options as the buyer is to accept your um, counter your counter offer,
Okay.
or just walk away.
Okay.
Now, if we were talking about 4 or 5 years ago, it's pretty normal. The seller counters, maybe the buyer looks at it and they counter, the seller counter. It could go on for a while. There's usually,
Because the seller had a lot more weight than.
yeah, it was a little bit better seller's market then. So
Okay.
usually the buyers were willing to hang in there with the seller
Go through a couple
and
of
go
counters
through
if
a
they
couple,
needed to.
yeah, a
Okay.
couple negotiating. Nowadays, we're suggesting to our sellers to be really careful about making a counter offer because of the market that it is. It's more of a buyer's market in our market right now, which
Mhm.
is in Minnesota, St. Paul, Minneapolis.
Okay.
So we're suggesting that tread lightly on your counter. Don't go
Mm-hmm.
really crazy. But I mean, if it's a very unreasonable offer, then I would suggest yes, we do definitely want to make a counter. But if we've got a fairly reasonable offer from the buyer, yes, we can counter on a couple minor things. But if you're willing to live, even though it might hurt a little bit, willing to live with most of the items in there, then I would suggest just sign it and take it, and be glad that you've got a able, willing buyer to buy your house.
Because the percentage of houses selling every month is much less than what it used to be 4, 5, or 6 years ago. So the likelihood of, if you've already got one offer, getting another offer right away again, if you turn away this buyer, or they get turned off for some reason, less likely. But what about, I think the thing that people often say is, well, the buyer is offering way less of a price than what I have my house listed at.
Mm-hmm. And
So
then,
what should I do about that?
yeah, and that's, I think, take a look at what other houses have been selling compared to yours again. We always take a look at
So the agent should be pulling that
yeah,
up.
we always supply the sellers with a more recent update of what's been selling,
Okay.
just to make sure. And then, for example, let's say the majority of the sellers are accepting a price, and then in addition they're paying like $8,000 in the buyer's closing costs.
Mm-hmm.
And if we get an offer similar to the buyer's closing costs of $8,000, well, we're not that far off. That's more customary of what's going on. So
Mhm.
if we counter back, we might not want to counter back on the closing costs. We might want to counter back on the price. But that also is where that brings up a point that we should be investigating a little bit what the buyers prefer. Well, number one, they're hoping that you don't counter at all as a seller.
Right.
But if the seller just needs to counter the offer, then is it better for the buyer to have a higher price, or is it better to have lower closing costs paid by the seller? So those are some things you should know, so you can make it a little bit more palatable for the buyer when he gets the offer back, the counter offer, that it's something that fits in their financial. Usually it's financial, that they have reasons why they're offering what they're offering.
But the price, the net price, whatever you want to call it, the price after closing costs that the seller might have to pay, I mean, part of that is the job of if you're the seller, part of that is the job of your listing agent to try to find out what that buyer's flexibility is.
Yep. Right.
Why the buyer offered that price.
Right.
And really, I mean, part of what it comes down to, right, I mean, is to have some data from the market. Mm-hmm. And hopefully the seller is already in that price range of what the comparables have sold for. Otherwise, it's hard for like the listing agent to go back to the buyer's agent and say, your buyer ought to really up their offer to this price because, and then there's got to be some kind of factual reason, like there's 3 other houses that have sold in the last month in this neighborhood for more than what you're offering, and we expect to get an offer pretty soon. If you've got, longer days on market and things like that, all those factors are going to play into the negotiation, don't you think, at the time of the purchase agreement? I mean, it comes down to the 2 parties agreeing, but sometimes those discussions can help to sway one party.
And let's go on the other side. Let's say you're the buyer and you want to make an offer. That should also be what we're investigating on the other part. How did the sellers come up with the offering price? What properties do they have as evidence that have sold that would justify us paying the price that it's listed at? So those are good questions that the agent working with the seller should be asked by the buyer's agent. Also, what is their time frame? What is their motivations? Do they have to be out of, they have to move for a job? How soon? All those types of things. Mm-hmm. So those are some things. So, as you can see.
And is there a bank involved and all that kind of stuff?
And there's some negotiating going on, what we call pre-offer negotiations, even though they're really not negotiated yet because there's no real offer, but it's the investigative time for both parties to kind of feel each other out. So the agent is feeling out the seller's motivations, and then the offer is made, and then the seller is coming back and asking about the buyer's motivations. And hopefully that's where you come to common ground at that point. But that's why it always helps the buyer, because if you're as a buyer and you're going to just say, hey, I'm going to make a $20,000 low offer, and you don't have any reason to justify that based on the market conditions right now, that's going to be hard to even have the seller counter. They might just say, you're way off here. We're going to just
or based on the seller's situation.
Yeah.
Like if the buyer's agent is able to find out that actually the sellers really need to close, fairly soon, and you're a cash buyer or something like that.
Yeah, you can close soon.
If you can make a case for why they should take a lower price because you can bring something else to the table, it's a harder to sell property, for whatever reason.
Sure.
Something like that. But I do counsel that most sellers, if you look at all the properties that sell, the list to sales price ratio is normally 90 to 100%. Most sellers, sometimes you get, a buyer wants to offer a really low price, but the seller could just as well lower the listing price and generate more interest in the property sometimes.
Yeah.
Rather than just accept a low offer. You do find that the majority, like 95% of properties sell between 90 and 100% of list price. So for as a buyer to expect a seller to accept 80% of list price, they could just lower the price, they'd get more offers, and they'd probably end up selling it for more. Although once in a while that does happen. But I think a lot of times buyers think, well, the market is bad and I can just name my price. Well, no, every market has a price point for every type of property.
And for example, right now we're just finding there's a little bit of a spike in buyers right now. We had a lull after the April 30th deadline for tax incentives, so we had a lull, and all of a sudden the pipeline now is filled up again with some more buyers, so all of a sudden we're getting a little bit more interest out there. So
it depends on the price range, depends on acreage,
Sure,
each
all the
market's a
different,
little
yeah,
different.
yeah, all the different forms, but, so, you might be in the market as a buyer searching, thinking that, hey, if I find a place, I'm just gonna make a rule of thumb, a 15% low offer, just no matter what I find. But that does change over time. The market has fluctuations, and sometimes they only last for 2 weeks. And if you make your offer in that 1-2 week period where there's a lot of buyers making offers, you're not going to get your price as easily as
Right.
you would if the market was a little bit more of a buyer's market. So when people say it's a buyer's seller's market, you can really micro that thing right down to like weeks or 10 days at a time.
Right. The
And,
period
yeah.
or the actual real estate sub-market, like
Right.
the area, the type of property. If you're looking for lake property on a recreational lake within 20 minutes of St. Paul or Minneapolis, that's really going to limit your
Yeah.
market. So you're gonna there's going to be a
Mhm.
certain type of market available for those type of
Yeah.
properties.
Yeah, and then again on a counter offer, let's just step back just a little bit on
Okay.
that. The seller now makes a counter offer to me, as let's say I'm the buyer. So now I'm looking at the counter offer. Now as I mentioned before, you can either accept it, counter back to the seller, or just walk away and make an offer on another house. So now we have to make a decision whether or not to accept it. So then again, we should be looking at the market. Gee, what is the seller telling us they're basing those numbers on? And
Because the seller can
yeah.
withdraw any counter as well.
Anytime, yeah. So as soon as that counter comes back, of course, we're to open field again. If you sign that counter as is, you've got a property now that you're going to close on. So if you counter that counter again, it opens up. The seller can just say, "No, I've got
Yeah.
another offer." In the meantime.
The seller could have got another offer, and they don't have to disclose
Nope.
multiple offers if they don't want to.
Yeah.
So-
So yeah, right.
Okay.
So anyway, so the main thing, just to kind of get you acquainted with how the counter offer process works, and sometimes it works over like a 2 or 3 hour period. Sometimes it takes a couple days or longer,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
So there's no set time frame or anything. Just to try to inform you about how the system kind of works, how the negotiations go.
Right.
I've had counter offers that have been out for like 2 weeks before it all comes
And
back
they all
together.
get accepted.
Yeah.
Everybody finally thinks
Finally,
about it. And
yeah. So that's how
Okay.
it works sometimes.
Well, thanks, Doug.
Yep.
Okay,
Okay.
appreciate it.
You bet.
Okay.
Sean.